Since his return to the White House, President Trump has repeatedly made Canadian softwood lumber a centerpiece of his trade rhetoric. In early January he quipped, "We don't need anything they have," explicitly singling out lumber and dairy as imports the U.S. can live without. A few weeks later, on January 31st, he doubled down on that message. "We don't need the products that they have," he told reporters. "We have all the oil you need, we have all the trees you need," meaning the lumber. By mid-February, speaking aboard Air Force One, he signaled concrete action. "I'm going to be announcing tariffs on lumber, probably, and some other things over the next month or sooner," he said, as he set the stage for roughly 25% duties to take effect in early April. Then, in early March, he invoked national security concerns, launching a Section 232 probe into U.S. lumber imports. White House trade advisor Peter Navarro bluntly accused major exporters of dumping lumber into our markets at the expense of both our economic prosperity and national security, underscoring that under Trump, Canadian softwood is not just a bargaining chip, but a flashpoint in his broader America First trade agenda. The U.S. and Canada are locked in another dispute over lumber. The two neighbors have sparred over softwood lumber from fast-growing conifers since the 1980s. Washington has intermittently imposed duties to offset what it argues are unfair domestic subsidies, and in the opening year of his second term, President Donald Trump is intensifying the clash. In March, Trump issued an executive order aimed at boosting U.S. lumber output by simplifying permitting and directed the Commerce Department to probe potential national security risks from lumber imports. Before year-end, Commerce is expected to raise duties on softwood lumber from 14.4% to 34.5%. Ottawa has historically resisted altering its forestry trade rules. Yet with the Trump administration taking a tougher stance on Canada, that position appears to be shifting. On July 16, British Columbia Premier David Eby told Bloomberg News that Canadian representatives are now amenable to capping the volume of softwood lumber shipped to the U.S. The goal of a quota deal would be to stabilize access to affordable building materials for Americans and secure jobs for Canadian workers, Eby said. Canadian officials are open to considering limits on how much softwood lumber can be exported to the U.S. to try to resolve some of the trade friction between the countries, according to the leader of British Columbia. "We think there is actually an opportunity for lumber to be one of the early agreements and wins that are struck," Premier David Eby said in an interview with Bloomberg News. "One of the asks for years out of the American coalition has been a quota, that there's a fixed amount of lumber that gets to come from Canada," he said. "And I think that for the first time, there's some willingness to have a conversation about what that could look like." Government ministers from Canada's provinces have had discussions with Prime Minister Mark Carney's administration to bring forward proposals that historically have been off the table, said Eby, whose province is the country's largest lumber exporter and home to major producers such as Canfor Corp. And West Fraser Timber Company. The goal of a quota deal would be to stabilize access to affordable building materials for Americans and secure jobs for Canadian workers, the Premier said. British Columbia and Quebec combined for 64% of all Canadian lumber exports last year, according to Statistics Canada data. It's not clear how much appetite the U.S. has for an agreement with Canada on lumber right now. Trump has also directed the Commerce Department to study the potential national security harm of U.S. importing foreign wood, which could presage additional tariffs. On the other hand, U.S. home builders have warned that Trump's tariff policies are inflationary and could increase construction costs by almost $11,000 a home. Canada represents almost 1/4 of the softwood lumber supply in the U.S., according to the National Association of Home Builders. Trump has been on a fresh tariff spree this month. He has announced new import taxes on copper, said he's likely to put levies on pharmaceuticals soon, and sent out letters to trading partners with high proposed tariff rates, while at times downplaying his willingness to negotiate. "We have tariffs going on because we want tariffs and we want the money coming into the United States," Trump told reporters Tuesday. Speaking to reporters on Wednesday, Carney called the softwood lumber issue a top priority and said the government wants to solve the matter as part of broader negotiations. "We'd like to resolve it at the same time as other trade issues with the U.S., he said. The U.S. Lumber Coalition said in a statement that Carney and Eby seek to set aside the enforcement of the U.S. trade laws against unfairly traded and unfairly priced Canadian lumber imports by proposing a negotiated settlement. Effectively, Canada is asking the United States to do a favor for Canadian workers at the expense of U.S. workers. The two sides reached a truce in 2006, when Canada agreed to a structure that saw export charges added to its lumber during periods when market prices were below a certain level. That deal expired in 2015. Time is of the essence to mitigate the escalating costs being imposed by the feud. U.S. anti-dumping duties are due to rise soon. Together with an increased countervailing duties expected later this year, it's possible total U.S. duties on Canadian softwood lumber will more than double to 34.5%. Canada has legally challenged U.S. levies on lumber, which means billions of dollars in duties that have been collected are sitting in escrow, and there are hopes that money could be returned to companies. Any extra tariffs from Washington would likely further strain Canada's beleaguered lumber sector and advantage U.S. South foresters, whose output has climbed recently. Still, the U.S. could find it difficult to quickly replace Canadian supplies, risking a rise in housing costs. Here's what to know about the commodity that has long defined U.S.-Canada trade frictions. What is softwood lumber? Softwood lumber is harvested from evergreen species like pine, unlike hardwood lumber derived from deciduous trees such as oak. Builders favor softwood in residential construction because conifers mature more rapidly and yield less dense wood, making it more affordable and easier to handle at scale than hardwood. Outside Canada, North America's largest evergreen tracts lie in the U.S. South. In 2024, the U.S. consumed nearly 50 billion board feet of softwood lumber, sourcing roughly 24% from Canada per Fastmarkets. A board foot is a 1 foot by 1 foot square of lumber, 1 inch thick. What is the softwood lumber dispute over? The U.S. contends that Canada subsidizes its lumber industry, driving down prices and dumping product into American markets. Central to this argument are the so-called stumpage rates that sawmills pay provincial governments for access to public forests. The U.S. argues these fees are set below market value, amounting to a subsidy, and has at times imposed its own anti-dumping and countervailing duties in response. Canada rejects the claim that it underprices stumpage to distort trade. The latest chapter began in 2016, when a decade-old U.S.-Canada lumber accord expired. The nations nearly agreed to limit Canada's share of U.S. imports to 30%, but couldn't decide what would occur if U.S. producers failed to meet their portion. The U.S. lumber lobby petitioned for reinstated duties, and in 2017 Commerce set combined countervailing and anti-dumping tariffs at 20.8%. The World Trade Organization in 2020 largely sided with Canada, deeming U.S. levies unfair. Those duties, reassessed annually, now stand at 14.4%. How is Trump escalating the dispute? Commerce is set to issue a preliminary ruling that more than doubles lumber tariffs, and its probe under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, already employed against steel, aluminum, and copper, could spur further import curbs. Trump hasn't yet specified what changes he seeks from Canada's lumber regime. Tariffs from his first term, combined with the U.S. South's faster-growing private forests, have bolstered domestic lumber profitability. In 2024, the U.S. South surpassed Canada as North America's top lumber producer per Fastmarkets. Can the U.S. just produce more lumber instead of importing it? The U.S. holds more idle forest land than Canada, and Trump's March order to ease federal permitting and loosen environmental limits pledges to expand domestic timber output. Trump asserted the nation possesses more than adequate resources to meet timber production needs, but heavy-handed federal policies have prevented full utilization of these resources and made us reliant on foreign producers. To implement that directive, Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins in April invoked an emergency determination on nearly 113 million acres, 59% of federally managed forest, to facilitate timber harvesting and wildfire control. In late May, the USDA also pledged $200 million toward boosting timber production. Nevertheless, although the U.S. has some unused capacity, fully onshoring lumber supply would necessitate new sawmills and trained labor, delaying a swift pivot away from imports. Another consideration is that U.S. and Canadian timbers aren't identical substitutes. Southern yellow pine, driving much U.S. South growth, matures faster than Canada's spruce pine fir. Yet builders have long preferred spruce pine fir because it's easier to handle and less prone to moisture-related warping. As of July 17th, spruce pine fir futures traded at a roughly $230 premium per 1,000 board feet over southern yellow pine. What does the escalating trade war mean for housing prices? Although lumber comprises under 20% of construction costs, the National Association of Home Builders warns that Canadian import restrictions inflate building expenses. After 2018 duties were reinstated, many U.S. builders turned to cheaper southern yellow pine, scaled-back home sizes, and redesigned plans to conserve materials. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching. As an independent channel, we don't have corporate backing. We rely on your support to keep going. If you found this video valuable, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment below. It really helps more people find our work. Thank you so much for being part of our community. Check out the next video on your screen. We picked it just for you.